Hi guys, Elle here, Elle and Artie. Welcome back. Today we're going to continue with our journey through all things Norse pagan and Astaru themed. And today I want to talk about specifically like the myriad of spirits that inhabit our landscape, that inhabit our universe. In Norse cosmology, just like in every other world mythology, there are tons, literally tons of different types of nature spirits, elemental spirits, ancestral spirits, spirits of the dead, and it's no different here in the Norse world. You'll see lots of different names for different consciousnesses, for beings at varying degrees of awareness. You'll come across things like the Vaettir or Wights, just spirits in general. You'll come across like the Disir, right? These female ancestral spirits. You'll come across the Elves and the Dwarfs, the Alfar and the Dvergar. By the way, that's the Old Norse names for them. But I am not, an academic. I'm not going to focus too much on things like etymology here, although I think that stuff is kind of vital to studying these things. And it's really, really fascinating. But I do want to mention real quick, Maria, butcher her name, Kvilhau, maybe, but she's got a wonderful YouTube channel. She's Lady of the Labyrinth on YouTube. I know we've been talking about her in the comments a little bit recently, and I'll put a link below to her channel. She is an author and a historian and talks a lot about the etymology of words and names, and from a more academic, historic sort of a standpoint. And I can't recommend her work and her videos highly enough. She's amazing. Yeah, but yeah, you come across all these different like spiritual categories for creatures at different levels. Like I said, the elves, the dwarves, the light elves, the dark elves, even the aesir and the vanir and man. We'll talk about the difference between the aesir and the vanir in another video. Later in the folklore, you have things like trolls and tomte, housewights and landwights and Vaettir, these water spirits. You'll come across things like mound dwellers and brownies and gnomes and all that fun stuff. And of course, a lot of this stuff is completely synonymous with things like the fae, your fairies, your Hindu or your Buddhist devas. What else? Like even like your elementals, your sylphs, your undines, your salamanders, the Celtic Sidhe, your mogwai, your naginis, your yakshas, your jinn and your genies, your angels and demons of all sorts. There's definitely a lot of correspondence and overlap there. It's just that it's not a simple world that we live in. The nature of reality is not easily definable. Not everything fits into a nice, neat little category. And that's one of the problems I think you come across when you're trying to figure all this stuff out, who's who and what's what. So best I can tell is if you go back to much older sources as opposed to like newer fairy tales and folklore, because with the later stuff like Grimm and all that, the vocabulary becomes jumbled, and certain words can mean all sorts of different things, as we just saw. And in those stories, you can sort of only tell what type of spirit or what type of being is being referred to from the context of the story. But if you go back to older sources like the Poetic Edda and some older sagas and such, a much clearer story starts to emerge. And that's the one that I'm going to try and share with you guys here today. So let's start with the dwarfs. It seems to me that the dwarfs represent evolving consciousnesses, all the way up to Lofar the Handed, all the way up to and including humanity. Now by this I mean, the entire mineral kingdom, the entire vegetable kingdom, the animal kingdom, everything from single-celled organisms all the way up to apes and mankind. They are the spirits that embody in the earth, that embody in the air, they embody in the forces of nature, they embody in trees, in plants, in animals, in our pets. They are all dwarves, they're all dwarf. It's my opinion that we only cease being dwarf when we awaken, or when we reach this certain stage of like spiritual awareness, spiritual evolution, when we die to our dwarf nature. And I think it's actually really interesting to look at how the dwarfs are sort of typically thought of, how they've been classically depicted in folklore and things like that. They're described as like dwellers underground. They live beneath us. They're craftsmen. They create physical, powerful objects. Even their size, we think of them as smaller than us, as little. But it's really their nature is something smaller. They're just less evolved. It really has nothing to do with height. But it's an interesting way to look at it, right? In the Eddas, I think that this idea becomes more clear, what the dwarves really are, especially when you look at things like their actual names. Pull up a list of Norse dwarf names and their translated names online, and it's really, really fascinating. Their names are so telling. They tell you exactly what they are talking about. If you look at a list of their translated names, you'll find things like the directions, color, things like yearning and longing. You'll see different plants and different animals, frost, illusion, all sorts of really telling names. And of course, you even have some of the famous dwarf names, right? You have Dvalin, whose name literally means asleep, unconscious, comatose, the dormant one. He's unawakened. He may be human, but he is still dwarf in nature. He is not yet awakened. And I think when they speak of, you'll see the term, the dwarfs in Dvalin's train, right? And I think what they're referring to there are all the myriad of souls working their way up the evolutionary ladder behind Dvalin. I want to read you guys one quick stanza from Völuspá, the 14th stanza. This is the same area, by the way, that you find like the tally of the dwarves, a listing of lots of the names of dwarves and elves and things like that. But the 14th stanza, this is just one translation, but it reads, "It is time the dwarfs of Dvalin's kin be named, up to Lofar the handed. They who have struggled from the hall's stone foundation up to the ramparts." I don't even need to talk about that, right? It's so good. Those who are struggling from base, from the stone foundation, up to the ramparts, up to the heights, up to the pure, from base to pure. Ascending the evolutionary ladder up. It says it right there in Völuspá. It's beautiful. But all these souls are becoming gods, or they're becoming godlike. That is the process we all undergo. Dvalin's toy, by the way, is a kind of a popular kenning or poetic metaphor for the sun. Excuse me. And I think what they are referring to when they say Dvalin's toy as the sun is actually the literal sun, the literal solar disk in the sky, because as a dwarf, because of his nature and how he views reality and how he understands the world, he wouldn't really be necessarily referring to anything deeper than that. He wouldn't be referring to what the sun can represent, or like the spiritual soul of the sun. I think Dvalin's toy is the literal disc that moves through the sky and lights his way through Midgard each day so he can play and learn and grow. Dvalin's toy. Another famous dwarf is Elves, whose name means all-wise or all-knowing. Interesting name for a dwarf, right? He's a dwarf. How is he all-knowing? Anyway, in Alvesmal, the story goes, this dwarf, Elves, seeks to marry Thor's daughter. And Thor's like, oh, hell no. It almost sounds like a bit of a racist tale or something. Like, how dare you, lowly dwarf, seek to marry a god? But really all that this She's giving me kisses. But really all that Alvis, this dwarf, wants is union with divinity. You know, he's seeking union with his higher self, you could say. So the story goes, and there's different versions of it, but basically Thor gives Alvis a chance to prove himself worthy, and he starts to ask him questions. Lots and lots of questions, which of course Alvis, being all-wise, has all the answers to. But it's through this question and answer, through this discourse, that we, the audience, learn a lot about how a consciousness at different states of awareness, consciousness at different levels, look at the world around them and how they behave in the world. You have everything from like giants to elves and dwarves to Hell's Dead, to the Aesir and the Vanir themselves. It's very telling, it's fascinating. But in the end, this whole thing turns out to be a trick played by Thor on Alvis. He keeps him talking all night until the sun comes up. And although this dwarf is incredibly knowledgeable and incredibly well educated about all sorts of things, he is still a dwarf in nature. He does not yet have the experience of awakening, and he is turned to stone when faced with the powerful light of the sun. You know, it reveals him for what he truly is, for his denseness. You know, he's turned to stone. Depending on what version you read, he can either be turned back into the mountain or something like that. And I think the story is really just saying that knowledge is no substitute for experience. You know, you won't evolve by reading about it. It must be experienced firsthand. You know, studying spirituality does not make you spiritual. By the way, I did spell the word dwarfs, D-W-A-R-F-S, the way I did in the title of this video on purpose, because that is sort of technically correct. That's the way dwarf was always pluralized, up until a gentleman by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien came along, and then he changed the plural to dwarves. How we sort of think of it as being correct now. We're so used to it, D-W-A-R-V-E-S instead of F-S. But oh, I just love him so much and all of his work. The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, all of it. You know, it's fiction, but ooh, he really understood Norse myth to an extent, to a great extent. One of the things, I'm about to talk about elves here, so it's kind of relevant, but I love the way that he describes the elves in his world. You know, they are... they're tall, first of all, their physique. They're not these fae-like or fairy-esque small creatures. They're tall, they're very ancient, they're old, they're very wise, they're skilled in magical arts. And in my opinion, the greatest thing that he has done for the elves in that story is he has them leaving. They're leaving the world behind. They're headed into the West. They are ascending, they are evolving, they're leaving this world behind. They're leaving Midgard, or Middle Earth, behind. They're hopping off this mortal coil, ascending, evolving, and you could say that they are dying to themselves here and being reborn or resurrected to their own immortality. And I think that his ideas ring true for what the elves actually are and what they represent. The elves, or the Alfar, are the awakened or awakening human soul. They could even represent, you know, the next stage of human evolution, you know, what we are becoming. 46 and 2, just ahead of me. Tool reference. I think those ideas are all connected, though. The chromosomal changes that we experience, or that they speak of, and all the New Age stuff. I won't go there. But the word elf, or elf, seems to come from like the root word for white or something like that. So it's white, it's light, it's bright, it's gleaming, very appropriate. And they're often described, the elves, as messengers of the gods. So it's like they're a link or a bridge between the two, between man and God. They're a channel, you could say. You know, elves would then be what connects man and God. Elf, it would be a god in progress or a god in the making. You could even call an elf like a demigod even. It's my opinion too that the word elf has sort of evolved over time to where it can now be used to describe any sort of a highly spiritual being or very spiritually evolved being, something like that. In Wagner's Ring Cycle, you have the character Licht Alberich, which means like light elf king or light elf ruler, and it's none other than Odin himself. You have Dane, right, the king of the elves, whose name literally means dead or the dead one, which is interesting to compare to something like Dvalin, asleep, comatose. He's not asleep, he's literally dead, this elf. He's died to himself, he's transformed, he's changed. Names are so telling. So also in the myths, you have the Dvergar and the Alfar, the dwarves and the elves, all described as different types of elves. You have your light elves, which would be like how we just described the elves, you know, this awakened consciousness. Or awakened human consciousness, and that's your Ljos Alfar. And then you have your dark elves, which would be how we describe the dwarves, right? And they're your dark elves, your Dok Alfar, your Svart Alfar. Just like the two worlds on the world tree on Yggdrasil, you have Ljos Alfheim existing just above Midgard, and Svart Alfheim or Swart Alfheim existing just below. And then I guess depending on where you choose to manifest or where you are capable of manifesting, you can sort of visit each and live from each. Oh, she's excited. You want to go home? So there's also these accounts in the Eddas of the gods in Asgard, you know, dining in the mead hall, discussing things, whatever they're doing, and you'll see described these sleepy, half awake elves in the background, you know, serving them food, serving them meat, whatever they're doing, but they're just sort of these sleepy figures, not fully aware, not fully conscious, not fully awake. Hanging out in the background of these scenes, and I've always loved that. It's like they're these elves that are almost capable of dining with the gods. They're almost conscious enough to be able to exist in Asgard and feast with the gods, but they're not quite there yet. It's just like another elf state, you know. And it's always reminded me of this recurring semi-lucid dream that I still have from time to time. It's really weird. But anyway, in the dream, I am in this giant theater, I guess an amphitheater, really, and it's filled with other people, and they're all together discussing things of great importance. I have no idea what the fuck they're talking about, but I just instinctually know that it's important. It's like spiritual things. They're discussing the future of the human race and the world. And me and this group of others, there's always a group of other beings with me, and we're just sort of hanging out in the background, having our own little adventures around this weird theater. And I get real close sometimes. I get very, very lucid, and I'm like on the verge of understanding what is going on there, and then it slips away. But yeah, it always reminded me of that sleepy elves in the background of Asgard. Who knows? So, I mean, even you could see, even in the old lore, there's still a lot of these jumbled kind of terms. You know, a dwarf can be an elf or a dwarf, and light elves, dark elves, all that kind of stuff. It gets a bit jumbled, even with some of the older sources. I think it is all about context. You can tell what they're talking about based on the context of that particular story, and based on the translation of of that character's name. That is huge in every mythology, especially in the Norse myths. I think it's really fascinating. Have you ever sat and read like a Native American myth or a story? Usually with them, they have fully translated the names of the gods and the heroes and the characters. And as you're reading these stories, right, it almost sounds kind of childish, because they're like, Grandmother Moon said to Thunderers, said to Rockman, you know, like these are weird names. But they're so telling, they're so descriptive of exactly what is being talked about. And their names can just tell you so much about their nature and what they represent. So look at those translated names. I think that that's something that we sort of lose out on, not having a mythology in our own native language, which is something that Tolkien really tried to give us, which is one of the reasons I love his stories so much. He gave us a mythology in English, kind of. So I think even though there is all this interchangeable terminology, you know, you look at the name and you look at the context and you'll be able to kind of figure out what exactly you are dealing with. So to sum things up, we go from dwarves to elves to gods, basically, on this great journey that we are all on. And I think I will stop there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you next time. Bye. Say bye-bye. Bye. Mwah.